right, Astra. Now, looky here. We thought we were coming up on this, end of January deadline. People were scrambling. People were saying, oh my gosh, well, are we going to do a debt strike? Like, what's the plan? And it felt like people were in that position again where they wanted and potentially were willing to act, willing to go on strike, willing to have significantly sized demonstrations. People were talking about 10 cities at the Capitol, but it felt like it was too late to really put anything of the scale that was necessary together. Now we've got another 5 months ahead of us. For March, April, May. 5 months ahead of us. It'll be the spring. The weather will be good in DC. We can be outside in these streets. We have opportunities to organize. What ideally should be in place at the end of April that would create sufficient pressure to have either the moratorium extended or ideally student loan debt actually canceled?
Absolutely. So, again, I just want to say Wednesday, the White House called me. They called my collaborator, Thomas Goki. So, what does that tell us? It tells us that they're paying attention to the pressure from activists and hoping that we're like, yay, and then we go home, which we absolutely can't do. We have to keep the pressure up. So the first thing I want to do is extend an invitation to people who want to strategize with us. On January 23rd, we're having a virtual debtors assembly and a strategizing session because we had a big plan in place. We were having a day of action, well, as a part of a week of action, but specifically the sort of centerpiece was going to be a day of action in Washington, D.C. and civil disobedience. So bringing the heat directly to Washington and actions around the country. And, I have to say, I didn't anticipate the payment pause happening before Christmas. I thought they were going to, keep dragging their feet to the last minute. And so, I am grateful that people are getting these months of relief, but I'm also grateful that we got to spend this time sort of pivoting and planning. So, we need to keep up the pressure and get to DC and put our bodies on the line before the May 1st deadline. And then I think there needs to be another escalation. We are part of what we want to strategize with people about on this call on the 23rd is a debt strike or, people who are going to be entering into non-payment, paying $0, sort of politicizing that and sort of coming forth. We have to look at what the political leverage is on this. What have we learned since March of 2020? We have learned that they don't need our money. Federal student loans have been paused for almost 2 years, and the sky has not fallen. Inflation has not, destroyed the world. So this is the point is, and I think what we really need to sit with this is like this, if they can afford to keep extending these final payment moratoriums, they can afford to cancel student debt. We need to show them that actually they can't afford not to, that they can't afford it politically. Because the thing is, because we've seen that all the payments can go off, debtors don't have the kind of economic leverage over federal student lending that we might have over other targets, right? Credit card companies need our payments to have their profits. Payday lenders need our payments. The federal government can print money. They do not need our money. So we need to create, we need to create a political cost for them. And I think that a strike is one tactic, right? It's one component of the strategy that makes them realize it's May 1st. And we actually cannot turn these payments on because we're looking into the midterms, right? And we're looking at our approval ratings, and we're looking at just like the mass discontent and outrage of people who are remembering the promises that we made going into the 2020 election.
It really does feel from where I'm sitting that the thing that moved the needle was the looming midterms and the realization that this issue is going straight to the heart of the core Democratic Party voters. Disproportionately, Black voters have student debt. You want to talk about these people are elites, blah, 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 but Democrats love to brag about how they disproportionately get college graduates, and these are the same people with student loan debts. And so they're really just like beating up on the base here. And I feel like the response has been to the idea that some of their core voting constituency might sit this one out because they're so pissed off and offended by what's going on.
And the data says that, there's a survey of Black voters that said 40% would seriously consider not voting if student debt cancellation wasn't delivered on. I also want to highlight, you said something really important. People often remember that Joe Biden said he promised to cancel an immediate minimum of $10,000. As you pointed out, he also promised to cancel all undergraduate student debt for people into public schools and HBCUs, private and public. And It's means tested in this stupid way. Again, means testing is mean. It's this arbitrary $125,000, not $400,000 income cutoff. But I think people, we also can't forget that. And if the constituency of people who would get relief from that HBCU promise, from that public university promise, were like, we are not letting this go because you actually can deliver on this, and you can't blame Manchin for being thwarted. Like, people need to make their voices heard. In addition to engaging in a strategic non-payment, engaging in debt strike, if that's what they want to do, there just also has to be active public pressure. And, I think economic disobedience and civil disobedience, right? I mean, people, this is our chance. We have the most leverage we're going to have on this issue. And these 5 months are critical. And that's why I really implore people, tweet about it, but also come to these strategy meetings and think about it. Get motivated by this idea of what your life would be like if you didn't have to make these payments.
Well, I think that this is a real testament to this idea of, I'm sorry to say it, and I'm not asking anybody to co-sign me, but vote withholding. This is not an organized vote withholding effort here, but there are enough people who are angry enough. The Democratic Party obviously feels like some of these voters are not going to come through. Part of the dependable voter base isn't going to go through. And I'd be very curious to see what would happen if there were an organized group of people, that could say, I can deliver the way that unions used to. I have the ability to deliver these registered voters to the polls if you fulfill these conditions. And student debt is obviously one that mobilizes people. But I want to talk specifically about this idea of a debt strike, because it's been very difficult for me to assess the appetite for it, how many people would be willing to participate, and what the cost benefits are that people would need to manage to decide whether or not they wanted to put their own debt and their own credit scores, et cetera, on the line. You've successfully managed strikes like this in the past of a much smaller scale. And so I'm curious whether or not internally there have been conversations about, if we are going to cheerlead a debt strike, if we're going to head a debt strike, how many people would need to be involved? How much buy-in would we need for it to be politically effective? What mechanisms are there to protect borrowers if things go awry? I mean, what technically, strategically does it look like to put together and organize a debt strike?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the moratorium has changed the political terrain, right? So I do want to say that, part of the way the debt collective, got this issue on the table and proved that cancellation was possible was through a debt strike of defrauded students. Sparky mentioned this at Corinthian colleges, which was this enormous and collapsing for-profit college chain that the Obama administration, after the bank bailout, was like, hey, let's bail out Corinthian and do some shady paperwork stuff so that students who are legally entitled to relief don't get it. So basically, if your school closes, you're entitled to a closed school discharge, which means your loans are gone. And they kept these schools on life support and other shenanigans that were completely unethical. People were already in default. They were suffering the worst consequences. Their credit scores were already crashed, loved, and couldn't pay. And so we announced a strike that grew in numbers. And part of it was politicizing non-payment. People were already not paying, alone, ashamed, suffering the worst consequences. And we said, come out of the shadows, right? Couple that with a political strategy where we would disrupt DOE hearings. We would, at one point, after months and months of meeting and making noise, we stood up Arne Duncan, the Secretary of Education, because it was a farce. We did a very aggressive media strategy, and we also had a legal strategy. So there are a minimum of two. There are many ways the government can cancel student debt, but one is through something called borrower defense to repayment. If your school defrauded you, you're entitled to relief. So we did the government's homework, figured out how you actually would use that right, and created an app that allowed tens of thousands of people to use that right. So a strike was a component of a strategy that was political, cultural, right? All this media stuff and legal all at once. here we are in a different terrain. We've normalized student debt cancellation. We've gone from the media literally saying to us, you guys are ridiculous and naive. The government will never cancel loans, to saying, oh, really? Well, since we've been fighting for this, in this 2021 alone, the year that is ending now, the Biden administration has issued something like $13 billion of debt relief, a lot of it for for-profit debtors using the mechanism we uncovered. They've used compromise and settlement, something we were shouting about in 2015, to cancel the interest that is part of the student loan moratorium. And we've also had to face the fact that debtors don't have that economic leverage here. So I think it has to be part of, again, a multifaceted strategy, part of what politicizing non-payment has always been really important for us. A lot of debtors they can't pay. We're saying, if you can't pay, say you won't pay, right? And if you want to strike, we will help you figure out how to make $0 payments in the safest way possible. Because I've defaulted on my student loans before, and I am very clear: an individual default is not a debt strike.
Right.
Debt strike is a concerted political action.
Are we then, like, because what it feels a little bit like, Astra, is that there's a little ambivalence, which I understand kind of ethically, to saying, you human being, don't pay your debts, given that these consequences can accrue. And I want to ask you,
but
Sparky.
I wouldn't say it's ambivalence. It's understanding where the political lever is. An organizer has to be like, what is the actual lever of power? And in some cases, when you're looking at finance, it is your debt payment, right? But in this case, because the government took over student lending, as Sparky said, right, and now these are loans literally, held by the federal government. And because Joe Biden has this unique legal authority through compromise and settlement, it's like, we know what the lever is. We're staring right at it. We know Joe Biden's staring at it too. And he's going like, I don't want to do it. I'm Joe Biden, the senator from Delaware. And that needs to be our strategic focus. And so striking is an incredible, it can be like a political part of that. And it's something that debtors need to talk about amongst themselves. But we need to make our pressure and our demands felt among the people who are making the decision not to act right now, right? And that means the Domestic Policy Council, the Department of Education, and the White House.
So, Astra, the options are to say, that is the lever, but Joe Biden can say, so what? I have the authority. There's already a failure to really acknowledge that he has the authority. They're still playing this footsie game where they're pretending that he doesn't. There was that leaked letter that showed that there was the memo that they had been pretending that they didn't have back in April.
We foiled it.
You foiled it, right? Sorry.
Request.
Credit to my apologies. You guys foiled that letter they gave you. It's all redacted. There's you can't read anything in it, but it's the memo that they said that they were relying on to decide whether or not he had the authority. They've had it since April 2020, right? Or was it April this year? I forget. It was April. It was a long time ago. And, Jen Psaki is still standing up at press conferences. I don't know if she's finally acknowledged that he has the authority, but most recently that I heard, she was still playing this game of footsie where she didn't. Secretary Cardona is going on these news shows, seemingly also not recognizing firmly his authority to cancel student debt, and that it's the same authority that's being used to continue the moratorium. All of this stuff, right? So the question is, when this day comes around again on May 1st, what is the so what that makes Biden want to continue extending it or cancel all student debt? And one is the threat that people are going to be mad and pissed off and not vote for Democrats in midterms, which, again, I think is a credible threat, but could be potentially organized in a way that made it even a bigger threat. And the other thing is people saying, well, screw you, I'm just not going to pay regardless, right?
So here's the thing. They don't need our money. That's what we've learned, right? They don't need our money, but they need our cooperation. And so that is where the power of economic disobedience comes in.
And by cooperation, right? you mean the voting in the midterms.
No, just that we pay like good little, docile debtors, and that we vote. But this is something I think debtors, my point is that I want debtors to be aware that it's not like a silver bullet. And that I think politically going into 2022, which is this midterm year, we need to be aware that our leverage is making them feel like they are going to lose that election, right? And that means reaching out to people who are not just ready to strike, who are like at that point in their political consciousness, but reaching out to people who are a little bit on the fence, who would love student debt relief, but aren't really ready to go to a protest for it, and say, this is a moment, put the pressure on and building our numbers and building that sense that you said earlier of like regular people are not only talking about this, but they're starting to feel gravely disappointed and angry that they're not getting what they were promised.
I hear that,
Right?
Astra, but if you say that you would want it to be, and I asked you when I asked you this last summer, you said something similar that you would want it to be a student debt strike to be part of a broader strategy.
Yeah.
I totally get that, but my question is, it doesn't seem like anybody, and correct me if I'm wrong, if a student debt strike is part of a broader strategy, somebody's got to be still working on the student debt strike aspect.
Yeah, so that's
right?
that's part of what's being discussed on this January 23rd planning meeting, right? Is sort of because this is the thing, we're a debtors union. I'm not the dictator of the debtors union who tells the members what to do. And also, I might have been a student debt defaulter at one point, but then I was somebody who like basically, got lucky, and my partner, sort of like that Christmas video that's been going around, right? My
where
partner,
do I get one of those?
I know. It was like, marry the guy who will pay off your student debt. And so this is something, just by the nature of the debt collective, of being a group that, like takes into account the desires and like the sort of temperature of our members and the broader public who's like clued into this. We need to strategize as a collective. But I could see a situation where we are engaging. So basically, we have not canceled, but postponed the actions that we were talking about that we were planning to do in January. I'm thrilled to have more time to do that. And also, as I said, because of the situation with Build Up Better, I think we're going to get a lot more support from unions, from other civil society groups who are recognizing that actually this is the core issue now, because that fight is over. So I think that is something, that strengthens us. And then, there could very well be a strike May 1st if they don't act before that. But we need to put the pressure on before May 1st, because May 1st is the deadline for them to cancel.
This is why I'm asking you now, because it is not, to your point, necessarily the debt collective's responsibility to be organizing the strike. And certainly there are a lot of different constituencies that might feel very differently about the utility of a debt strike or the desire to do a debt strike in this moment. But what I would hate to happen is for people to believe that because the debt collective has such a presence in this space that, someone's on the case. And then that, there is some constituency of people that really does want to do a debt strike, but that's not really
I would rather see people engage in mass disruption physically on May 1st. Yeah. Because I think the thing is, like, again, where is the power, right? Where, you could do a debt strike and they wouldn't even freaking blink an eye. That's with federal student loans, right?
Why do you say that? Because
it depends how many people. It depends, like, again, like, it has to be a component of a broader strategy. Like, to me, this is just, as an organizer, you have to do a power analysis. You have to do a power mapping. Where is people's power? And they absolutely have their place. And I hope, that one is democratically deliberated on and is part of our strategy. But I also think debtors need to realize, like, they need to, like, push the envelope and get out of their houses and, like, and
but that's the thing. You keep saying, yes, it's part of a strategy. But to me, a protest on May 1st where everyone's also like, rah, rah, Biden, you're evil, like, but also is like sending their checks off to Great Lakes is counterintuitive. It seems like a natural part of any movement would be, guys, we're all in this together. He can't strong arm us. I hear your point about this not being financially, the pressure isn't that the government goes bankrupt because it's not getting our student loan payments, right? The way that you would boycott a store and they're going to go out of business. But it's the symbolic pressure of everybody saying collectively, we're not going to
take it anymore.
Obedience. Yeah. Exactly. We're not, it would be so counterintuitive, it seems to me, to be protesting on the Capitol and sleeping in a tent city and doing mass disobedience, but also setting up your auto pay to Navient. Right.
So but I think we need to be clear on the timeline here. People need to protest and get to DC before May 1st, right? So that, because May 1st is when they're turning on the payments. Then there needs to be, we need to map this out, right? We're like working towards a November deadline. So May 1st very well could be like, look, we protested, we put our bodies on the line. We told you that this was outrageous. And now we're saying, okay, we're not paying, because we are trying to demonstrate the fact that, we're ready to, not play along with the rules. And I think if people who are not paying already, should come out of the shadows and say that, and the people should try to People should not commit financial suicide, but I think there has to be an escalation strategy.
Well, do we have a sense of people? Is there outreach to say, and Sparky, I want to ask you as someone who works with debtors, in a kind of more direct, services capacity, is there a way to identify people who are not paying and reach out to them and get them kind of pre-committed to participating in a quote unquote strike? I mean, they're already striking because they're not paying.
Right. I mean, I think this was the first thing that Astra said, which was that it's sort of about the political consciousness of student debt, right? Mm-hmm. Most people are not paying their student debt. I mean, nobody's paying their student debt right now. Most people in normal times are not paying their student debt. Most student debt, I think it's only like 55% or something that's even in a repayment status at all. Mm. And the percentage of people who are in the standard default repayment, which is a 10-year plan, is, it's tiny. I'm sure it's less than 20. I don't know exactly what it is, but I'm sure right now it's less than 20%. I don't know, Astra, if you have that stuff, but we're talking about if what you're saying is, and this is what I think I've heard before, and the way I kind of think of it is like, if you are not in the standard plan that the federal government wants you to be in, you are on debt strike. You are on debt strike already, and I want you to know that you're on debt strike. Right. And I want you to think about your debt and to talk about your debt. I had this experience recently, with the public service loan forgiveness tweaks that happened to the program. I just sent a little email around my office. So my office, it's like a legal aid organization. It's mostly, but not totally, lawyers, do all kinds of different services, some related to debt and consumer stuff and some not. I was actually very surprised by how many responses I got to the email from people who were essentially just not thinking about their debt. These are like attorneys who help people who had stuffed it down into the darkest place of their psyche because they found it so stressful. Relatable. And had never actually talked to anybody about it before, had never looked at what their options were, had never thought about the situation that they were in. Some of them were in default and didn't need to be, right? I think that the point that the Debt Collective has been pushing and that Astra is making is like really, really important, that even just to counter this bullshit narrative that's happening right now, right? Like, people need to think of themselves as a part of a movement that is actually as large as it is. And right. You are already part. If you're on income-based repayment, like, you're already there. The leverage point is really important, and I don't know what the answer is. I'm,
I guess what I'm saying
I'm
is
not going to dictate it, but the leverage is not financial,
right?
There might be a financial move that could be symbolic, but the leverage is in the mass and whatever that
right.
kind of
so
mass
how do you
movement
get the
is.
Mass? How do you get people to see themselves politically as part of a group of striking debtors in quotation marks because they are not repaying their loans? How do you get to see them as part of that political group if no one is talking in terms of a debt strike?
Well, I think what Sparky is getting at, though, is that in a way, millions of people are already in non-payment. So I think you're kind of getting people into non-payment is not actually the hard part. It's convincing people to be.
But that's not what I'm saying.
Right, but it's convincing people. Right, but it's convincing people to be political actors, and that means things like coming to planning meetings, doing actions in your town, keeping the pressure on. I feel like I've become such a Washington-focused person. It's only because of how federal student debt works, right? We need to keep our eyes on the prize and where the leverage is, and so the Debt Collective. There is a very strong likelihood the Debt Collective will be organizing a debt strike. I just want to be honest with people that the leverage, it is not like a workplace strike that's going to shut down the factory. We have been not paying, right?
I completely understand that.
And so the thing is that people will need to do something more proactive than the negative act of non-payment, or just basically having the shift of political consciousness, which is important, where you go actually, I'm not paying because I'm entitled to debt cancellation, right? People will have to, I think this is a very critical 5 months, and people need to throw down for it in multiple ways. And I think that it could be an epic win, to push the American government to cancel debt for people would be truly, at this scale, would be truly unprecedented. It would be, not a wealth transfer, right. a significant redistributive act. And so I really think,
Justice.
This is the
It would
thing.
be justice.
It would be
Right.
justice. And so all tactics, we need a multiplicity of tactics here.
So, what I'm speaking to, my observation is that in the lead up to what we thought was going to be the end of the moratorium,
Right.
this month, as all of these PR moments combined to get people worked up into a fever pitch of anger about Biden ending the moratorium that Trump started in an election year.
Yeah, that's important. We have to remember this is Trump's moratorium.
This
It has
is
not
Trump's
even been.
moratorium.
It has not even been fixed to include people who were left out of Trump's hasty decree.
So my observation is that those people are looking for. They are politicized to a degree and want a landing pad, a coalition to join, as it were. And that is why people have started kind of haranguing me personally, because they know how much I talk about student debt, about why isn't there a student debt strike? Where is the student debt strike? Where can I sign up? Where can I join? Where can I put my name on this sign up sheet? And from a rhetorical perspective, as a comms person, which I know is not the most important aspect of this, it would be enormously powerful for me to be able to say, I have 10 million people who say they're not going to pay their debts. I have a quarter of all student loan debt, or a fifth, whatever, 100,000 people who say that they're that have signed and said they're not going to pay their debts. I've got 500,000 people who say they're already in non-payment. They were in non-payment before and they're going to continue to be in non-payment, whatever it is. But getting those people who exist, to your point, that all these people are already in non-payment, to self-identify in some way that they can be pointed to as a political constituency and then use as leverage, as you describe, in this electoral context. But I'm having a difficult time comprehending, like, I understand that we want people to get involved more substantively in different kinds of community action, but I hate to say this, but like realistically, there's a cohort of people who wants, for better or for worse, a kind of symbolic, virtue signaling kind of expressive movement to say that they've joined. And it's difficult for me to imagine what that is.
Yeah, I guess part of me pushes, like, I'm just like, I don't do this full time to just like virtue signal and give people an expressive, like, I mean, we have to be really hard nosed, I think, in this moment. I think people are in this political awakening that we're having, right? And the like growing awareness and outrage. Like, I think people will be even more ready to engage in this issue in the months ahead, right? We saw the like pressure building, the outrage building, the frustration. Debt Collective definitely, had an increase of people saying, fuck this, I don't want to pay. So I think there's energy there to organize with, but I'm like, if we want to win, then we do have to be like, well, what needle are we trying to move, and what will do it? Because the reality is, I could say, hey, I've got 50,000 people who aren't going to pay, but they know millions of people aren't going to pay. They know tens of millions of people are not going to pay. Over 1 million people default every year.
But the government, being in the government, knowing that because of being the government, is a very different thing from the discourse being about the fact that there are masses of borrowers who are not going to pay and who also see themselves in a politicized light that's going to manifest in electoral results. And it seems to me that if we want there to be mass protests around May 1st, if we look at examples of like last year and you see the George Floyd protests and stuff, that is also a lot of virtue. That's a lot of virtue signaling, very emotional, sincere angst that drove people to the streets that had an effect on the political dialogue. Now, I would argue that all that energy wasn't correctly funneled into the right channels, but it does seem to me that that's an important part of a movement building exercise, and that something like a debt strike, something like pointing to the injustice of being asked to pay in this moment at a certain date, that there is a turn on date that activates people in their anger the way that we saw leading up to this most recent turn on date. It feels like almost necessary to exploit that political energy to feed into all of these other more substantive organizing goals. It just seems like a real opportunity.
I'm not sure of the causality, like which flows into what, but I mean, the Debt Collective is absolutely like working on this strategy as a component of the larger buildup and escalation to May 1st. So, I'm not, I love talking to you because it's hilarious for me to be like, I don't know about a debt strike. I think it's just, to me, it's one tactic of a variety that we have to deploy in our strategy to keep putting the pressure on this administration. And so that is what, again, if people are looking for that home base and that place to land, they should come to this assembly and strategy session that will be held on Zoom on January 23rd. But I would really encourage people, to, think in those political terms too. Like, we have a window with this administration, and how do we, put the screws on them to make them deliver? And this is the thing with like organizing, is you don't get to repeat yourself twice as the conditions change and as you're working on a different, you're working with a different constituency and on different terrain. And so the debt collective is, figuring this out as we go along. But I think you're absolutely right. There's, huge numbers of people who are eager to join this fight, and like, we welcome them with open arms, and we absolutely support, debt refusal. Yeah. And want people to stand up for their rights and to join us. So people should come and plan and scheme with each other.
We'll definitely put links to where people can find that in the show notes of this episode. I hope people do participate. Sparky, do you have concerns as someone who is a practitioner about what the downsides could be for people who are participating in such a strike?
No, yes and no. I mean, I think that the debt collective, to the extent these discussions happen, I have full faith that everyone who is involved in them will be completely informed on what the consequences could possibly be for them, right? Like, any of these actions have potential consequences, right? You're like, oh, I'm going to go do civil disobedience. Am I concerned that people might go to jail? Yeah, people might go to jail, right? Yeah, no, that's true. Bad shit can happen. It's about whether you know what you're getting into and whether you make the choice. I'm going to go on strike with my union. Like, that's going to be fucking hard, right? Yeah, there are going to be consequences. But if I understand that, and if I do it collectively with a community and we have some supports in place, then great. So, I would strongly encourage everybody to make sure you know what the consequences of what you're thinking about doing are going to be, particularly if you're trying to go do something on your own or with a little group. And there are plenty of places that you can go to get that information, the debt collective being one of them. I should also note, as a legal services attorney, like, over the last few years, legal aid offices have really built up a lot of capacity to advise people on student debt issues. And, look for your local legal services office. They might have a very knowledgeable attorney who will talk to you for free about what your situation is. And this is something I'm constantly harping on, is like, people often don't think of financial and debt problems as legal problems, but that is exactly what they are.
I'm curious, just generally speaking, is the major concern people's, because people know that, if you go to a protest and you get arrested, that people have a sense of arrest and bail. And I mean, these are things that we see on Law and Order every day. I think there's less.
Yeah, you want the horror list?
Yeah, there's less like, what happens to your credit score? Like, what? Like, I think that it's more of an abstraction here.
Yeah, look. I mean, you could suffer some credit consequences, right? That's gonna, if your credit gets hurt, that's gonna affect all kinds of aspects of your life. That could make it harder to get an apartment. It could make it more expensive to get other loans. Could make it more expensive to get insurance. It could make it, depending on where you live, what kind of job you have, could make it harder to get a job. The federal government can do a lot of things that private lenders can't even do, right? They can go and they can garnish your wages without taking you to court first. Much harder to fight federal garnishment. They can garnish things that aren't wages that other lenders can't touch, right? If you're on Social Security, if you're on disability, like, they can just go and take 25% of that if you go into default on your student debt.
And so, some states, you can lose your driver's license, you can lose your professional license. Let's say you cut hair, which means you lose your income, right? That you're supposed to pay. I mean, it's completely illogical from the perspective of being the debt collector, but that's, these are serious. And it was all news to me until I defaulted that one sunny afternoon.
Yeah. And I mean, even like, tax return, like scoop up your tax return. It's not a consequenceless action, but I think it's both the case that, again, it's not, most people are not paying. I mean, everybody's not paying right now. Most people are not paying most of the time. We need to think of ourselves as being in this movement already, as not having an individual problem that we're kind of ashamed of and don't want to think about and want to stuff down into our psychological horror hole, right? But like, no, this is, we're actually in this together. And I think one of the ways that you can feel that solidarity is just by going and signing up for the debt collective and going to the strategy, participating in the calls, right? I was on like the Twitter space the other day, and it was really heartening to hear all of these people talking about their issues that you don't normally talk about with people.
And also, I think there are ways, and this is what you can do in a collective space like the debt collective, is say, okay, you're ready to take on you're ready to go into the space of a strike of non-payment. But like, what can you do to maximize the impact? So I don't know if people saw, but before this payment extension, I believe it was 9 Congress people in kind of like swing district kind of things wrote Biden and saying, please, please extend the payment pause, right? Our constituents aren't ready. Those are the kinds of, not just the squad who are like on team debt cancellation, but these people who are moderates or who are in like, unsafe seats need to hear from their constituents being like, we're not going to pay and we're not voting for you again unless you tell the president he needs to frickin' deliver on this promise. And so those kinds of things that just give something an edge of strategic impact, right? Like, okay, so let's tell these people we've got the progressives, we need to go for the moderates, we need to go for these folks who are already feeling like, that this is an issue, that it is urgent. And so those are the things I think that why it's important to like be part of a group and part of an organized formation. So we can do these things in concert and go, okay, we've hit a dozen of these folks around the country to try to multiply the leverage we have, knowing that ultimately it's one man's signature that is going to do this, right? Because this isn't happening through legislation and it's not happening by magic.
Right. Well, I appreciate both of you spending almost 2 hours with me today in what has now become a fireside chat on my end due to my lighting malfunctions over here. But can you tell our listeners where they can find more from you, where they can find you on social media? And Astra, of course, I want you to drop all of the contact information for the Debt Collective.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to say, read everything Sparky has written on student debt, because before I knew Sparky's face, I knew him from reading his great essays in current affairs and stuff. So, and then, you can find the Debt Collective at debtcollective.org and at Strike Debt on Twitter, where we are perhaps too active.
No, you guys are great. I love your account. All I do, I'm like a bot retweeting Debt Collective tweets.
Don't stop. We need you.
And Sparky, where can people find you on social media?
If you're thinking about looking for me, go on Twitter and go to @StrikeDebt or go to debtcollective.org. No, I'm at Sparky Abraham, but like really, go to the Debt Collective.
You're a real hero, Sparky. Thank you both. You are great. And I want to congratulate you again, Astra, for being such an important part of this push that's got us this moratorium extension. You are like a light in the void. And thank you both for all of the work and writing that you do.
Thank you.
And to our audience, as always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.